we'll see how this goes. Just so that you all know, this is my first time operating this as a webinar. So I'm a little more used to being in a room full of people and being able to have a high level of interaction. So I do want to start off by just asking you to, in the chat, just if you wouldn't mind, just type in, who are you actually coaching? Are you coaching novices? If so, are they middle school? Are they high school freshmen? Are they collegiate novices, adult novices? It's helpful to just get a sense of what the balance is of people who are listening, simply because there are some things that are a little bit different as we go through this, depending upon that kind of variable of age. So I'm going to jump right in. The other thing I'm going to say is that we have way more to cover than we're going to be able to cover in the time that we have. And so I'm going to go through some of this stuff pretty quickly and leave a good chunk of time, hopefully, if all goes well, to answer questions so that we can dive into the topics that people want to know a little more on. And of course, you'll have access to the presentation. And but maybe most importantly, I always preface these things by saying I like to think that this is the start of a conversation. It's not the only moment in time. So if there are things you want to know more about, like, feel free to reach out. Super happy to try and communicate on this and go back and forth on this or any topics about the sport and coaching. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump right in, and we're going to start off with just this overview, some of the principles and first steps. We're going to talk a little bit about how we approach technique, training, what's effective instruction, and a little bit about motivation and assessment. So one of the guiding principles here is this idea of curriculum mapping, which is essentially suggesting that everybody within the program should sit down and have a comprehensive list of what are the things you expect the members of your team to know. Everything pertaining to, do the coxswains know the rules of rowing, and when did they learn that? All the drills and skills you want, all the behaviors they should be able to demonstrate. You know, do they need to know how to rig a boat? Well, okay, when are they going to learn that? And everything then that you put in that bucket needs to be kind of figured out as to when in the progress of that athlete's career are they going to learn that. Otherwise, things have a tendency to go by the wayside. And so I would suggest that you do this as a staff, head coach, novice coach, et cetera. And it's definitely a process. You'll go through and be like, oh gosh, we never really covered this, right? So, and if you haven't done it before, you know, one thing to do is just kind of go back and think about your season, like, what are you doing? And then what do you need to add in? Second principle I want to introduce people to, and we could spend hours just talking about this, is the idea of a situational leadership model, which is basically understanding that the athletes are going to start out in a situation where they actually are usually fairly motivated but have very low competency. And then the natural progression is for them to actually move into this mode, and we'll talk more about this in my second presentation, where they are still relatively low in competency and their motivation is going to be decreased. In other words, novices are usually really excited about learning something new. And so there's a natural progression that actually the second step is really tricky because they tend to figure out what they don't know. And so nobody's happier than, you know, 2 weeks into their novice year. At some point, as they go through the transition from novice to intermediate, they tend to still not be very good, and the motivational piece gets harder. And then as their competency grows, eventually you think about, you know, the sophisticated varsity athlete, and they should have high competency and high motivation. And the thing that's important to understand here is that the role of the coach through these phases, the role of the leader through these phases, should really change and be quite different. And so we're going to be mostly talking about this first phase here, which is also known as sort of a directing phase, where the athletes have limited to no skills. They may have some crossover skills from other experience, but they need to be told how to do almost everything in really plain language. That's my biggest failure as a coach. I forget that Novices don't always speak rowing. That's always a challenge. Since we do a lot with walk-ons now, I have to remember that they don't necessarily know what way enough means. And there needs to be a good chunk of positive reinforcement. And the third principle that I want to be really clear on is this idea of long-term athlete development. I've spent a lot of time looking at other models, and you know, the U.S. rowing's working a bit on also having a good model for long-term athlete development. But it's really important that we begin to understand this. I think particularly if you yourself are new to coaching, and actually, if everyone wouldn't mind in the chat, just type in how long you've been coaching. How many seasons have you been a coach? So I can see that scroll by and get a sense of it. But I think a lot of coaches do what they did at first because it's a really important sort of a basis of your own understanding. And of course, the problem with that is that you tend to remember what you've done as an experienced varsity rower more than you remember what you actually did as a novice rower, because that was so long ago. So, all right. So what does long-term athlete development say? It says that we need to know the developmental age, particularly when we're dealing with 7th, 8th, 9th graders, even 10th graders, that their developmental age has a lot more to do with what's going on physiologically than, say, their actual just age as a number. And what's particularly important is kind of what's going on with their hormones at different phases. And one of the things that we're almost all of you are going to be dealing with people who are not fully grown hormonally in terms of their systems, even if they are quite tall and look like they're, you know, children. So, and one of the things that's really important about that is that it's really appropriate to spend a lot of time with that aerobic base training that Dr. Seeler was talking about, and a little bit appropriate to spend a certain amount of time dealing with power and skeletal muscle strength. But we really don't need to be doing a lot of that 2 to 8 minute hard piece work in terms of their physiology. Now, there are some reasons, maybe in terms of race preparation, stuff like that, you need to get them to do that. But physiologically, they're not going to really be able to respond particularly well to a lot of that. We'll talk more about that when we get into training. And I think maybe this is one of the most important things I want to get across to you, which is that their performance at this stage is going to be largely determined by their rate of development and not their long-term potential. In fact, to some extent, it's a little bit inverse, that the athletes that you have that are going to be the biggest stars as 8th and 9th graders, just as for example, are probably the ones that went through puberty the earliest. And those athletes may actually have a harder time being successful as you move into 19, 20, as they get older. So really important to understand, we don't want to ignore the athlete that is, you know, not as developed. That kid may actually be the kid who in the long run is going to be the most successful athlete. Australian Institute of Sport recommendation says skill-based work over long duration at low intensity should dominate the training plan of all up to the age of, say, 14 or 15. So what does that mean? It means, you know, a lot of technical work, a lot of low intensity, steady state. You don't need to be trying to just race all the time. And I think it's important that, you know, the weight training should largely be about learning movement patterns. And you're not trying to get a lot of this sort of max super strength stuff. It's just, again, not appropriate for this age group. All right, so first steps. I think it's important that we're always trying to start with assessing what you have, like who is the group of athletes that you have, and understand a little bit what their backgrounds are. Nobody comes in as a blank slate. We think of them as a blank slate, but they really aren't. And you need to determine what your goals are, and you need to start setting some of your priorities. So what is their prior athletic experience? Get a training history and an injury history. Just because they're new to you doesn't mean that they don't have an injury history. And it can be quite important to figure that stuff out and not wait until it pops up. And a lot of times I find with these kids, they're not very forthcoming about it unless you ask about it. And I think this is a really critical thing here. When we're dealing with these new kids, their own sense of agency and efficacy is fairly low. It's really important to actually ask them questions like, what have they done before that they're really proud of? What have they accomplished before? And this can be done in a couple of different circumstances. I query it in terms of questionnaire stuff so that I know and have a record of that. But I think it's also a really important thing to do in the group as the group is getting to know each other. Very first day of practice. And it's a really interesting study that was done by Homeland Security looking at building highly effective groups where they're bringing in different groups with different law enforcement backgrounds. And one of the things that they found was that one of the strongest indicators of the success of the group, of the team, was whether or not in their first meeting, all of the individuals had a chance to talk about what they were good at and what their skill set was. And that first meeting permeated the effectiveness of the team throughout the length of the teams working together. And it has these really important things where it validates the individual who is there, but it also gives a way for the teammates to get to know each other a little bit. So understand how important and informative that initial meeting can be. And then John Sisk, who is one of my assistant coaches for a long time, always recommends sitting down with the athlete to fill out these forms, because sometimes you don't get necessarily much of a response unless you're sort of hand-holding them a little bit. Okay, so we talked about setting your priorities. I do always think that this idea of the near-term competitive success is really a distraction from what you should be focused on. As a head coach, I've always tried to say, the most important thing to me is that the novices are having a good developmental experience, not that the novices are necessarily out there and focused all the time on outcomes. But I think it is important to understand in the big picture of where the team is when is the group expected or needed to have an impact on the varsity squad? Because that's going to have a lot to do with some of the things when you think back to that curriculum mapping we were talking about. Like, if it's a big team, and I've coached both smaller and larger teams, what's going to happen next? What do they have to be ready for? That's important for you to sort of understand when you're planning your priorities. And so then you're going to make your daily plans to build towards both those intermediate and also the long-term goals. Again, the goals need to be set up on the basis of the curriculum mapping, and you need to try and create a timeline. So basically trying to figure out, and I think this should happen in parallel with training, and just understand, like, if you don't put it down, it's a good chance it won't happen. I also think it's always really important to be aware of things like exam schedules. But when we start thinking about this, like, one of the things that we're going to get back into is this idea of how long can the athletes maintain focus, and seeing that is something that is trainable and needs to be trained as much as anything else. And so I like to think in terms of, like, not only are you increasing stroke rate over time, you're also increasing the length of the piece before you stop and kind of reset. That's a really important thing, because the bad rowing tends to happen when the athletes have exceeded their ability to maintain focus. Okay, so we're going to talk about technique, we're going to talk about training, effective instruction, motivation and assessment. So if we jump into the technique piece now, and again, I don't know which of these, normally when I'm in the room with a bunch of people, I sort of get a sense of what people want to spend more time on. So we're going to leave a lot of questions people might have on this stuff towards the end and let us dig into this. So I'll go through all of it fairly quickly. So novices should be taught to row in a way that sets them up for future development. In other words, if you learn good fundamentals, then the more advanced skills are going to come naturally and more quickly. So a little bit of patience, I think, always pays off. The important thing to understand about our sport is that an experienced rower executes the stroke faster than you can think about it. In other words, rowing at the competition level needs to happen on following an ingrained pattern. It can't be done thoughtfully. And so one of the things that's most important with novices is to get this rapid progress by figuring out what are some elements of intuitive motion, and allowing them to use that as kind of a basis for what it is they're doing. And then what you need to do is then, sort of say, okay, what are the things that are not intuitive? I've done a lot of learn to row days where you take people who've never rowed and you teach them how to row in a day, whether it's whether we're talking about like National Learn to Row Day, stuff like that. And one of the things I like to do right off the bat is get people on an erg and say, do what you think rowing is. And a lot of what they do will be right, and which I tell them, and then say, okay, here are the things you need to focus on that are not intuitive. So there are some things that you're going to have to ignore and deal with later, because there's only so much you can do right off the bat. You've got to let them actually take some strokes. But right now, let me just give you an example of something. So I can't see if you're doing this or not, but we're in a room. What I would do right now is just tell everyone, just stand up for me. Just everyone stand up for a second. And then sit down and stand up again, but stand up slowly. And then sit down and stand up really quickly. And the point of this is that when you stand up faster or slower, you're still using the same muscles. And you didn't necessarily think when you stood up more quickly that you were going to try and work harder. You just did the motion more quickly. And you can do that because it's an expert motion. You don't think about how you stand up. But really, a lot of the drive can be seen as being really similar to this, right? If you just say, okay, do that same thing and turn it so that you're standing away from the foot stretchers, then actually that's a pretty good template on which to start the idea of the drive. And you can come back to that way later. It is important, I think, to understand, the first things to really talk about then are this idea of body preparation on the recovery. All right, some key first concepts on technique. It's really important with novices that you're working from the athlete's body out. Okay, so it's great to coach the blade. It's great to coach the boat. I think that stuff is really important. I do a lot of that when I'm dealing with varsity crews, but when you're dealing with the novices, it becomes really hard for them to understand that. And I think particularly understanding the points of contact, we'll talk about that in a minute. But also work to build body awareness, particularly with the age group you're dealing with. A lot of these kids are relatively little awareness of what's going on with their own bodies. And so then the sort of second step is building this idea of boat sensitivity. And this is incredibly important to me as a coach. I spend a lot of time with the idea of building kinesthetic awareness, but also building an awareness of what the boat is doing. But you've got to do that slowly. And I think it's worth questioning the novices as you go through this process of learning, like, okay, you did this. How did that make the boat move? How did that change what you're feeling from the boat? And I think an awareness of balance should also come really, really early. So don't overdo the totally stable platform. I like moving pretty quickly into this idea. And I think that's one of the reasons why if you have access to tubby singles, it's the best way for kids to learn. Even just finding kids that have had a background, spending some time in kayaks or canoes, stuff like that, really helps them to understand the counterintuitive balance proposition our sport brings them. And then the idea is to move towards external focused feedback. And again, this is something that I talk about a lot in a lot of presentations, but external focused feedback is getting the athlete outside of the body. So the process of moving from novice to intermediate to expert, a lot of it has to do with moving from this point in which you're first figuring out what are you doing with your body, and then you're moving more and more to an awareness of what's going on outside of your body. And with expert, with relatively high level rowers, we want all of our feedback to be this kind of external focused feedback. All right. contact points, really important starting off point. And I think one of the things that's undercoached in this country still, years ago when I was first coaching at community rowing, I remember Ted Washburn, who for years was Harry Parker's novice coach at Harvard, said the problem with rowing in this country is nobody teaches people how to hold an oar. And I realized that not only was he right, but for years coaching development camp, doing ODP stuff, seeing kids from all over the country, realizing how few of them really had been taught good fundamentals of grip. So I always make sure we go over what a good grip is. And I don't, we could spend a lot of time talking details of technique. That's not the point of today. If people have questions about this, we can talk about it a little more. But understanding just that we really need to make sure that we're actually talking to them about grip, how to sit on the seat, and also the use of the feet. And I think it's scandalous how many people never get taught basically how to set themselves up in the boat. And it's worth making sure that early on that that's actually happening. There's a question here about externally focused feedback, and generally I'll take questions at the end, but I think it's worth just mentioning this quickly. So externally focused feedback means anything that you're saying, like if you tell someone to throw the ball farther, that's an external focused feedback. If you tell them to do something within their muscles about how they're using their arms or their legs, that's internally focused feedback. If you tell someone to, squeeze your glutes more, that's an internal focused feedback. If you tell them to accelerate the handle more, that's externally focused feedback. And it's important for expert motion, for getting this idea of being able to do something without a lot of thought process, but rather using that imprinted model that we're trying to build in the brain, that we're doing most of our stuff as externally focused feedback. So, but with novices, they're not ready for that. So that's hence the idea of moving from internal to the external focused feedback as their body awareness increases. So body positions, I think, are sort of the next step that I always do, right? So you move from how are you in contact with the equipment to what are the positions that are body. A lot of our sport is about putting the body into positions of strength. And again, for novices, one of the things that I think is really important, we all know that length is good. When I look at mistakes that people are making, when I was at development camp and I get kids from all over the place, a lot of their mistakes are coming out of this idea of misunderstanding length and trying to row long because their coach told them to, and not rowing with long connection, but just what they feel is long. And they're become resistant to change because they don't want to shorten up, but actually their effective stroke isn't very long. And so I think it's really important to be relatively moderate with your layback at the beginning. And one really simple cue for this is just this idea of not allowing the athlete to fall down, and teaching this by staying horizontal through using the focus of the eyes. So keeping the eyes focused on the back in front of you or off at the horizon if you're a sculler or the stroke of a boat, and trying to stay level. On the erg, I cue, like our novices now, I cue our novices to sort of look over the top of the erg monitor and just try and make sure they're staying horizontal. And I think that does a good job of sort of setting up how long they're going to be rowing with the body at an early phase of their career. And you can always go through, as they develop good core support, you can always start to lengthen that out as they develop better blade work, but don't teach them to row too long too early. I think it's critical to engage, to get good core engagement, teach the pivot at the hips. Again, I think a lot of the focus early on needs to be teach them technique that will enable them to stay healthy. So if they're pivoting at the waist, they're very likely to develop back problems. If they're pivoting at the hips, even if that means their stroke needs to be shorter because they don't have the requisite flexibility, you're going to increase the chance that that athlete's going to be able to stay training. So, so here's another little thing to understand about core stability. I like to do these tricks on land sometimes. So just again, something you can try right here. Everyone just takes a moment to raise your arms up over your head and do that a couple of times. And notice what happened to the position of your spine as you did that. Now engage your core positively and raise your hands up over your head. And what you see is that now probably the first time you arched your back a bit, and the second time you were able to keep your back stable. And so understanding, having the athlete understand that core stability protects the back and creates that strong position from which they can apply force. All right, recovery sequencing is one of the things that is not intuitive. In fact, when I teach people on like Learn to Row days, I tell them that if they learn nothing else, at the end of the day, they'll learn how to work out on an erg at the health club and not look like a health club rower. And one of the two lessons that I try and make sure they do is understanding this recovery sequence. It's not intuitive. You all probably know they want to pop their knees way too early. And you know, I think there's a lot of stuff, and I actually totally agree about sort of whether or not we need to have a sequential or a more segmented style of rowing. But I would encourage you to really teach your novices with a very segmented style of rowing. That even if at the long run, it's very easy to blend. But to me, when you approach what is the style that we're going to teach the athletes, the question is, well, what happens if they make a mistake? And if you have a more blended style of rowing, and the athlete manages to bring the handle into the body before they're done with the body swing, let alone if they do it before they're totally done with the leg sequence, the consequences for the movement of the boat are drastic and not good. If you are more segmented and they start to make mistakes, then all they're really going to do is move more towards a quicker blend. So really get this idea of teaching that sort of 1, 2, 3 segmentation first, and it becomes relatively easy to get them to blend it all together. So I don't mean to come down on everybody who says, oh no, I want to do it more as a unified motion. That's fine, but start out more sequentially. So the drive is quite intuitive, I think, for novices. And I think the thing that becomes really important is understanding that if you teach them under load or a few strokes at a time, they'll usually execute fairly well. So it's amazing to me, you can take people with relatively little experience and put them one of those weighted erg handles that's attached to a weight stack, and they'll usually do the drive fairly well. And so understanding then that the problems come in as the boat starts to move faster, and that enthusiastic novices will start to do things like break the arms or open the body too early because they can't keep up with the speed of the drive and they want to feel effective. Doesn't make them bad people, just means that they're trying to feel load. And this is one of the things that really creates problems. And so getting them to understand the importance of being quicker with the legs, super, super important. Okay, I'm gonna move through some of this a little quicker, but just because there's more stuff we want to get to. I think the key thing is trying to get the correct muscles in the correct order. Once we start to get that, then they can start to move faster. So again, it's a cry for patience here. The more patience we have, generally, I think the more long-term success you're going to find. All right. Teaching relaxation from the beginning is also really important. It's the tendency to have a high level of stress a lot of times in an unset boat, and getting the athletes to actually relax on the recovery can have a tremendous impact on allowing for the boat to actually start to set up. And I like to teach them that tension starts somewhere, tends to start in the hands or the face. And so you can call them out when you start to see that kind of like, you know, they're all tense in their face because of what's going on, and just get them to take a moment, stop, relax, and get back to that idea of relaxation, and really allowing the recovery to be a time when they get to reset for each stroke. It's amazing how well they will row if you just row one stroke at a time. Right. So, all right. So let's talk about effective instruction. I think it's really important that if they cannot explain it back to you or to each other, they don't really understand it. With novices, we are all visual learners, or almost all of us are at least, and copying is super powerful. So I think every session should be started with a demonstration of some sort. Like, don't go out on the water first thing. The first thing is set up what is it you're going to do, show them on the erg, or even you can do a lot of showing people just on land standing in a field. I've done a lot of that. Video can be helpful. And if you're going to do video, showing video of other teammates of theirs or previous novices is more effective than video of strangers. So with this age group, peer demonstration is really important. There was a question earlier about using JV or varsity athletes, and I think it's a really powerful thing to do. I really highly encourage the use of peer demonstrations. So understand with these athletes that the key to rapid learning is not something that happens just at one pace, is getting the challenge level right. And so where the appropriate challenge level is going to lead to the fastest learning is somewhere between the routine and making it too easy and where frustration sets in. But, and I think this is really important to understand, that frustration is a reaction to circumstances. And so if you can set them up to understand that their ability to stay focused on high challenge has a lot to do with how well they're going to learn. Right now, you can try and get them to maintain focus even when things aren't going particularly well. And I think this has a lot to do with trying to create, and again, I'll talk about this more and in some of my other talks, about trying to create growth mindset and trying to create a situation where it's okay to fail. And so allowing them to sort of have that freedom is super, super important. And so a lot of that also has to do with, how do you make the athletes feel? Do you shame the athletes when they aren't doing it well, and allow them room to try and keep trying and keep working things out and make adjustments. I think it's also true at this level with novices that games and competition can lead to a higher level of focus than you just telling them that. So just one really simple example that I've done to good effect with a lot of crews is say you're at a point where you're trying to get them to do a pause, maybe at arms away or bodies over, and balance the boat. And if you just have two boats out there and you're just trying to do that, it's one thing. One little game that I've played is say, okay, like every time you do it successfully, take a couple more strokes, usually 5 strokes, and then add another pause. So you go from 5 and pause once to 5 and pause twice, what have you. And now you set it up as a competition. You say, okay, we're going to do this from here to whatever bridge, and we'll see which boat can add in more pauses. And what you find is that the moment it's become a little competition, their engagement with the challenge will generally quite rise over just saying, okay, try and set the boat up as much as you can. Scaffolding is incredibly important in terms of technical progressions, so that you can start with the thing that's relatively easy and keep taking it to the point where you see signs that it's really hard for them. Because again, if our goal is to try and spend time in that sweet spot that's in between the easy and the hard, you need to keep adding challenge levels. So, right, start slow. Ideally, you want to take it all the way until the point where they're able to demonstrate the skill that you are doing at something that approximates wherever your race cadence is and whatever amount of pressure is appropriate to the level of the crew. So you can go from pairs to 4s to 6s, or maybe even all 8. You can start to add pressure, you can start to add speed. But you know, it always pains me when I see less experienced coaches and they're like, okay, we're going to go do this drill, and then the drill is maybe too easy, and then they're like, okay, now we're going to go out and row and do a piece, and you haven't taken it from the one all the way through to the other. Varying tempo and speed is a good way of increasing the challenge. But the point is that you want to look for moments of breakdown, and then you can back it off a little bit and try and get them to execute it more with more expertise. But if you don't see moments of breakdown, then you haven't had that challenge piece. And on the other hand, if you just let them do it poorly, you're going to reinforce bad habits. So that's where the art really is of trying to find that challenge level. And the eventual goal is to be able to perform the action consistently and at race cadence. So just a really simple example here. You can look at it as you will later on of sort of how to do that, but I don't want to take the time to go through it right now. All right, training. So moving on to training, I think training novices is a particular challenge. And part of that is that their bodies are out of balance. So rowing too fast too early can create bad technical habits. Athletes transitioning from other sports or non-athletes will likely have muscle development imbalance for rowing that will leave them vulnerable for injury. So a tremendous number of athletes that I see come in with really strong legs, and of course they lack the core and the back strength to transmit that force that they can develop from those trained legs all the way through to the handle. I think, you know, Nordic skiers have a big advantage here, but for the most part, most of the common sports that these kids are doing in their town league sports or whatever else they're doing before they start rowing is going to lead them with this kind of muscular imbalance. And it takes about 5 years at 500 hours per year for them to get beyond that, which means they're going to be not ideally balanced for the sport of rowing for the entirety of the time that you're dealing with them. So understand that, you know, they're gonna continue to develop well past high school, assuming that they stay engaged with the sport. And so I think it's important to look at the physical development and technical as totally separate challenges. And so, you know, what's important at this stage is flexibility, endurance, a little bit of speed, and some strength for the girls, assuming that they've already gone through puberty. What they don't need to be doing is that kind of anaerobic endurance, i.e. long race pace type pieces. And they don't need to be doing a lot of max strength, especially the boys, because really they shouldn't be doing that until they're more like 15, 16, 17. So you need to get a sense of, are their bodies really ready for training? So look at assessing flexibility, look at assessments of their conditioning and their previous, you know, get a sense of what their previous training history is. Just understanding like how many hours a week did they do a sport. You may find out, oh, I did this sport, I did that sport. I can tell you from my history of my own kids that some of these kids do sports and they're doing it 2 days a week, and some of them are doing it and they're doing it 6 days a week. So make sure you know what is their training history. And I think, you know, land training can be used to develop the athlete's body to be ready for competition, ready for the physiological challenges of rowing, while your early water practices are not at all focused on training and they're just talking about technique. It does not take a lot to create an adequate training stimulus at this phase. So you can keep your idea of like, okay, we're gonna give them an adequate training stimulus on land first and then go out on the water. Or even if you have limited resources, if you can do it, you can switch back and forth. One of the most successful novice teams I ever observed they didn't have enough boats for all their novices. And so they were forced to do this thing where they would split the practice up, and half the time the novices would be doing stuff on land and half the time they'd be out on the water. Well, this turned out to actually lead them to a really great formula. And they would routinely, even though they had the least amount of water time, be one of the most successful novice teams come Northeast Regional. So, important to understand, you don't need to just be constantly having them do the hard work on the water. Better, I think, particularly early on, is focus on technique, gradually build what they're doing on the water, leave the training on land. It's a much more controlled environment and really easy to make sure that they're executing a lot of these motions really well and creating some of that muscular balance that you want. And I think also on land, teaching them how to properly do just body weight squats or jumps can teach movement patterns that then you can reference in your terms of how you're teaching drive technique on the water. So you're giving them a sense of athleticism that then can translate into what it is they're doing. I think the cross training is also going to allow for a much greater training of the aerobic system. The limitations are always at this point going to be skeletal muscle limitations, right? So the heart and lungs are able to take more stimulus anyway, and so by doing a mixture of different kinds of activities, you can really keep working the aerobic system without running into your limitations, which are generally going to be pain in the back or what have you. Core strength definitely needs to be developed before novices will be able to sustain technique for the full length of a race. And fitness training on land should be something you're doing at least on some level almost every day. Flexibility work, so important that you're doing it at the end of practice. I think a lot of coaches get caught up into there's all this stuff I want to do, and you just skip that phase. But understanding how important flexibility is, they don't have to be, ballet dancers, they don't have to be Gumbies, but they do need to, for example, if they can't lie on the ground and raise their leg past 90 degrees, then they're going to be at risk for a back injury. So they need to have enough hamstring flexibility that they can do at least that. So even if you do nothing else, like have them do partner leg over stretch at the end of every practice. They won't gain any flexibility over time if they are stretching pre-practice. I'm not a big fan of stretching pre-practice. Maybe some ballistic warm-ups as part of their land work, but the real key to increasing flexibility is doing it post-practice. And again, work on the ergometer is going to allow for higher quality than it will on the water at this phase anyway, because they don't have good technique. And so this is where your first longer duration work should start to happen. And in general, it's a good idea to keep the length of everything you're doing to 10 minutes or less, but you can use short breaks to refocus. So I think I'm old enough to remember when the University of Washington women were really good the first time, and that they used to never do any pieces more than 10 minutes on the erg without stopping and stretching out and refocusing. And if that's good enough for University of Washington back in those days, it should be good enough for any of you. So, and I think the earliest training load on the water should be developing specific strength stuff, which is to say relatively short bursts of high power by pairs and fours. But just get them, I mean, probably a lot of you do this kind of stuff anyway, but like get a sense, like 5-10 strokes at a time, low rate, like going through by pairs. And one of the things I like to do a lot is say 5 easy, 10 hard, 5 easy. And again, like the key here is going to be watching how long can they start to sustain stuff before you start to see breakdown. And the quality of what you're doing should be your guide. So you're going to allow them to do more as you see their ability to stay focused and execute. So when you see breakdowns and what's actually happening on the water, then the question is that a breakdown of the length they're able to focus, or is that a breakdown of the length of they're able to maintain core integrity? Either way, you need to change what you're doing and not have them take a lot of strokes with bad form because you're just inviting injury. So majority of work should be aerobic or short intervals. I'm a big fan of short cycle intervals. So 10 on, 10 off, 20 on, 20 off, that kind of stuff, or even shorter, 20 seconds on, 40 seconds off. That kind of work early on for novices, I think, is really, really important. And then you can start to go minute on, minute off. very sparingly use the longer stuff. When you start to go 5 to 10 minutes, it's really not a good idea. Very sparingly. You've got to do some of it because you got to get them used to the idea they're going to race for that long. But hopefully you're able to do that at sub-maximal, not super high intensity first, and just be like, okay, like we're going to go for 8 minutes at steady state pressure, and can you do that and maintain your focus? If they can't do that, then they definitely aren't ready to do higher intensity. So understand this idea of training the length of focus is as important as what's going on in terms of the physiology. So you're always watching for that technical breakdown. All right, motivation and assessment, and then we'll try and get to some of the questions. So understand, just as an overview here, that the novice athlete is going to have a motivation that is probably not what most coaches think it should be. But it's actually developmentally appropriate. And that is that, they're there to have fun, they're there to make friends. Don't ignore that. Use it to your advantage. Eventually, you are going to change their motivational structures, but you cannot rush that prospect. And you don't want to underplay how important it is that it should be fun. The first goal of any coach is to make the athlete want to come back. Right. And so let's try and remember that it's up to us to create a situation that is fun and engaging for these young kids. It's not up to them to rise to some level of like, oh, I want athletes that are super goal oriented. Like that's going to take time. So they're going to want to be a part of something, and they're going to want to, mastering new skills is really fun and important. Now, what is fun, right? I always tell people, like, we want to have fun. Winning is more fun than losing, right? So we definitely want to engage in that idea. But fun happens when the challenge level is appropriate, right? So when you set up challenges and they are able to do them, that is super fun. I can't tell you how much fun. I do this thing sometimes I remember doing a development camp where I have them all stand up in the boat and hold their oars up one at a time. And they had a tremendous amount of fun doing that. They loved it. Then they wanted to do it every day. Of course, we didn't have time to do it every day, but camps, you can get away with some of that stuff. But games can be powerful and still be productive, like, fish game or relays are fun. So my daughter used to do this thing, this track program at Needham Track. And when I say used to, I mean, she started this when they had 150 kids in the 3 to 5 year old group. And they're doing Simon Says. Well, what they're doing with Simon Says is that they're actually stretching, right? But they make a game out of it. They're doing Duck, Duck, Goose. They're doing all this kind of stuff. And it's brilliant because to the kids, they're just playing around and having games, but they're actually doing a whole bunch of things. One of my favorite things to do with novices is I used to do this before things got in the Charles River got so crowded. So I'd get a bag of rubber duckies from my party, and I'd put the kids in tubby singles and throw rubber duckies all over the pond, and they'd go and try and collect the rubber duckies. Like, super fun. And they have to figure out how to maneuver the boats. So, all right. I think this is a really fun lesson. So, novices are unlikely to have the performance goals integrated into their head at this point. So, you may think, oh, you've got to work towards a 2K, you got to work towards this. And some kids, if they come from racing sports, may have some level of that in there, baked in already. But a lot of times, for example, I'm a big fan of those short stuff, so I might have them do some 10 to 20 second bursts. And you can set that up as a, like, all right, go as hard as you can. But if you set it up as a relay, they go a lot faster because now they're doing it with their friends and they're cheering each other on. And it's like, you can test their max watts on a 20-second burst, or you can set it up as a relay and suddenly you see these kids are doing way more max watts. So understand that's where the novices are at. Like, if you can make a game out of it, if you can make a competition out of it in a group, you're going to get a better performance. So, it's super important that you assess what you assess they will notice, and everything that you care about, you need to assess. So are you assessing flexibility? Are you looking at things like balance? Are you finding ways to assess technique? Course fitness, that's easy, but also boat speed. And the reason I think it's important to put down these markers of boat speed is that benchmarks give you an idea of sort of how the group is progressing, but that also gives you, in a sense, an intrinsic motivating factor, which is to say, as if you set something up like, okay, how long will it take us to go from this bridge to that bridge? Or I used to do it both two directions because that way you are accounting for current. But it doesn't matter that it's really slow to them. It just matters that you're getting better, right? And of course they're going to be getting better. And so if you're doing that, they feel successful. And the most important thing we can do is create a situation where we're looking for those moments where we're building moments of success. So they're building their sense of efficacy and ability. So regular assessments give them chances to be successful. And that idea of building daily successes and daily goals, this is what's going to move them towards having that motivational framework that you want them to have as varsity athletes. Understand that comparisons within small groups are likely to lead to increased motivation, whereas comparisons within really big groups will tend to be amotivating for people who are not near the top of the group. And so, keep your comparison groups relatively small if you want to do a lot of that kind of stuff. With a large team, this is the way I would always post it, any kind of assessments. If you're going to post them at all, I would post it alphabetically because they wouldn't go through this stuff. And then I would highlight on a separate piece of paper where the top third is of the team. More or less, dependent sort of how big a group was. But then I would also separately post like who were the most improved person. So the single most improved person would be at the top of one sheet. And sometimes I would look at it as like improvement week to week, but I think it's also important with to do as long a term as you can. And so sometimes I would also post, particularly if it was positive information, like how are they doing compared to last season's group, stuff like that. So, at this point we've got, what do we have, about 8 minutes left. So I want to just skip the rest of the slides here and spend a little bit of time looking at some of the questions that people have had, and seeing what are the things on here that are that people are most interested in digging into. So as we look at this, just going to look over some of these.
Yeah, Ethan, we have some really great questions that popped up.
Yeah. So, the first thing I actually just want to reiterate, this idea of encouraging mentoring by novice athletes by their JV and varsity teammates. Yeah, I do that all the time. I think it's really important. But even within the novice group, giving them a sense of agency and helping each other, you can do really simple things. Now they all have smartphones, for example. Even if they don't know a lot about what they're supposed to be doing, you can have them film each other and spend a moment showing that film back and forth to each other. And you can have the coxswains then work with them, or maybe one or two more experienced people, or just say, okay, look for this, like give them a cue and start to build their eye for what's going on with each other. So even if you don't have access to some of the more experienced people all the time, there are ways in which you can get them creating that idea that they're all in it together to try and help each other get better. So I'm a big fan of that. As I look through some of the questions, connection be one of the most inconsistently used words in rowing. I agree. So when I talk about connected length, from a really simple perspective, if the blade is in the water, there has to be a bend in the oar for that blade to be applying force that's going to be moving the boat forward, right? And so when we think about length, the athlete has a tendency to think about their perceived length, how far they're reaching. But what actually matters to how the boat's moving is how long is the phase in which the blade is actually working against the water. And so trying to get them to be aware of the feeling of resistance on the blade rather than, oh, it feels really long, or, oh, I feel like I'm laying way back. Well, they can be laying way back and the blade can be out of the water. So when we talked before about this idea of building that awareness from the body out, like it does become important that they start to understand, like what really matters is not length, it's connected length. And that connection can be felt, like actually feel the length of the work. So like what is a good way to teach lat engagement versus traps? Well, first of all, it's really important to understand that it's very hard to teach a negative, right? And I think if they have already started out where they're up in their traps a lot, okay, then you need to address it a little bit on land. I think the water is a really complicated environment to make that kind of a change. And so, but you can do it with a kettlebell or a dumbbell and get them to actually feel that squeeze. But I think the other thing about this is that in the boat or on the erg, this is a key moment of understanding the importance of grip. So right now, if you just take something, let's see if I find even something like this. If I have, this is my fake oar handle. If I'm connected through my first and second fingers, there's a natural tendency for me to come up through here and connect up in my traps. If I'm connected through my pinky and ring finger, there's a natural connection through the backside here and into my lats. So when you see people who are up in the traps, they usually haven't been taught how to grip the oar properly. And you see this a lot where they tend to float out and let their fingers come off too much. And now they're up here and locked up into their traps. So making sure that the pinky and ring finger can maintain connection at the catch allows them to feel that engagement through the lats. So really important, again, to understand that, are we actually creating the connection properly from these fundamentals? Because you can talk about it all you will about the lats and the traps, but if it's not actually happening at the level of the fingers out on the oar, you're not going to get that change. I find myself weak on programming flexibility and do the same set of static stretches every day. I don't have something good to point you at right off the top of my head. I think, to me, I'm not an expert in this kind of stuff, but to what I've learned from other, when I talk to sportsmen, when I talk to all kinds of different people, this idea that the hamstring flexibility is super important, hip flexibility is super important. But there's a lot out there on stretching, and you can probably get it from a better source than I am. But I think, I tend to look at just a couple of really simple things. I always start early on just to get a sense of, like, do they have that 90-degree range of motion? Because I know that if they don't, then that's going to be a main point of focus. But also, like, the same set of static stretches might be great. They might be great. So don't beat yourself up too much about it. So. All right, so I do need to be sensitive to time because I'm talking again in just a few minutes. So,
Ethan, we had one quick last question that was early on. If I could ask that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you were speaking about previous injury for athletes and reporting that, you mentioned having a questionnaire. Do you have a sample of that maybe we could share later with the attendees, or something that you had sent out, or maybe just key things that you asked?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really simple, and I would say that everybody should come up with their own list of questions, but I on it should be, have you been injured before? What other sports have you done? How many days a week have you done organized sports? But I also always like to include that question of, like, what have you accomplished that you are most proud of? Whether it's athletically or not athletically. Like, give them a chance to tell you things, and what activities do you do, even if it's not organized sport, right? Like, some of the best athletes I've had never done a sport, but they happen to be really active and they do a lot of hiking with their family. Well, you want to know a sense of like, what have they actually been doing? And then the other thing is like, I frequently will have an additional question of, what have you done in the last 6 weeks? Because you also want to know, like, they may have done other sports, but they haven't done anything all summer long, and you want to know that as well. So you just want to get a little bit of a sense, because it's going to turn around and bite you in the butt if you have people who are at really different levels of their physiological readiness to start the season, and you're not accounting for that. So just get that really simple stuff. I mean, honestly, I think I have made up a different sheet every time I've done this. I've never used the same one twice. And part of that is like, what's the group I have and what do I know about them? But like, the simple questions are, what have you been doing? What have you been doing recently? What's your background? What do you feel like you can add and bring to this sport? And almost always, like, they frequently will be like, oh, I've never done anything like this, and I'm going to be terrible. But I've actually done a lot of sailing, and I'm like, actually, here's what you can get from having been a sailor, or this is what you can get out of having been an ice skater, or this is what I've had tremendous luck with people who've done equestrian, and they're like, they never occurs to them that might actually set them up well for rowing, but it does. So just giving them stuff that they can jump onto as being like, hey, this is going to help you, and it gives you an ability to help reference for them, like, oh, I can speak a little of this language, or maybe you can't, but like, if you can sort of say, well, this is how this is helpful to you, and this is how it's similar. I mean, even I think actually just having a background in music is worth knowing, because it gives them a really good sense of idea of timing and tempo, and as well as focus. Actually, people with a background in music frequently make good first strokes. So.
Awesome. Yeah, Ethan, that's perfect. We are right at time. So
yeah.
Thank you for really having a lot of information squeezed into a short amount of time.
Yeah, and I got to say, like, if there are things that people would like to dig more into, like to know more about, please feel free to reach out. Super happy to try and follow up with people. And I always, I love it when people send me emails or whatever it is, and want to start a conversation. So
great. All right. Have a good rest of the conference, and thanks again, Ethan.
All right. So I guess, how do we close this out and move on to the